Okay, folks, I think we will make a start. So welcome to the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. This is the first of our scheduled talks for this term. In Oxford Speak, this is Trinity term, our third term. Our theme is inclusion/exclusion in the context of religion and culture. And our speaker this evening is Dr. Brian Klug, who's a Senior Research Fellow at St. Benet's Hall here in Oxford University. It's a great pleasure to introduce Brian. Brian and I first met through a mutual friend, and on the day of my first visit to Oxford, when I was Director Designate at this point, this would have been October 2019. Brian invited me out for lunch. So we went to a French restaurant and we sat down and we had erudite conversations about continental philosophy, which I pretended to understand, but quite frankly, I don't. We also spoke about identity politics and what it meant to be Black, African, Caribbean, and for him to be Jewish. We shared our travails as both members of the Labour Party, kind of off and on at various points. I'm named, as some of you may know, I'm named after Tony Benn. So obviously, like, we have our shared travails about being Labour Party supporters. And at the end of the conversation, I remember thinking to myself, so I've sat down, I've had erudite conversation, we've eaten fantastic French food and drunk a surfeit of nice red wine. If this is indicative of what this Oxford gig is going to look like, then I think that me and it may well work out quite well. So I thank you, Brian, for giving me such a fantastic welcome to Oxford back in 2019. Brian is my favorite Jewish political philosopher. Actually, like, to be more accurate, Brian is the only Jewish political philosopher I know. So actually, it's really good to have you here, Brian. And we are in your hands, so please share with us your thoughts for the next coming minutes. Please keep yourself muted whilst the conversation is taking place. We are recording this talk, but actually at the end of the talk, we will stop recording, and then please put your questions into the chat box and I will chair the Q&A. So Brian, we are in your hands.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for that most original introduction and for reminding me of a meal that I hope we can have again one day before too long in Oxford. May I say, it's a pleasure to see so many names and faces of people that I know and with whom I have had conversations about subjects that you and I, Anthony, have had over the years. By the same token, hello to the people I don't know. And I hope that what I have to say will reach the variety of people who are here today. The title of my talk is Appropriating Judaism, ? Christian Seders, Christian Zionists, and Other Cases. Introduction, Amen. Some of my best friends are Christian, and almost the whole of my professional career has been spent at Catholic universities. Over the years, as you can imagine, I have had a number of experiences that bear upon the subject of this lecture, and I thought I might begin by telling you about one of them. It was spring 1998. I had just finished 6 years as head of my department at St. Xavier University, Chicago, which was founded by the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas in 1847. I was due a year's sabbatical leave. And after consulting a friend at Oxford, who as it happens was an Anglican priest, I wrote to St. Benet's Hall to inquire about a possible vacancy for a residential visiting fellow for the following academic year. What happened next, which led to the first of my 20 plus years at St. Benet's, bears retelling, but it is not the experience I'm about to narrate. I shall save it for the end of the lecture. When I arrived in Oxford in Michaelmas term 1998, Father Henry Wansborough, who at the time was the master of St. Benet's, knew full well that I was Jewish. The other senior members, who were mostly monks, knew too, but the students, all of whom in those days were male undergraduates, knew not. Not at first, not until the day when I, as it were, came out of the closet. And like Clark Kent ripping open his shirt to reveal he was Superman, disclosed my true identity. Not that I rent any garments. It happened like this. One evening after Vespers, about 10 minutes prior to the ringing of the dinner bell, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. It was the master. Henry explained that he was dining out that evening, as was the chaplain, and he wondered, would I be so kind as to preside at dinner in the hall in his absence? Well, one does not turn down a request from one's master. However, I hesitated, since the role included saying grace before and after the meal, and I explained to Henry that I could not bring myself to make the customary reference to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He understood. Why not say the Jewish form of grace, he suggested. So I did. I went down to dinner, and so as not to alarm the students, I explained to them what was about to occur and why. Picture the scene, the long table extending the length of the refectory, the members of the hall, predominantly Catholic, lining both sides, each standing behind his chair, listening respectfully while I recited aloud the Hamotzi, the Jewish bracha blessing over bread, first in Hebrew and then in English. When I finished, they all said Amen and promptly crossed themselves. Feeling like Woody Allen caught in the glare of the headlights, I froze. A panic took hold and I thought with alarm, what have I done? The ghosts of rabbis past, especially the rabbis who taught me Torah and Talmud at the Hasmonean, the Orthodox day schools in Hendon that I attended from age 5 to 18, seemed to be looking grimly over my shoulder, as if I had committed a grave sin, not merely by desecrating God's name, but much worse, by wasting their time. I could almost hear their silent reproach. All those years when they patiently tried to teach me the rudiments of Judaism, didn't I understand anything? Well, to be fair to myself, how could I know what would happen? I didn't ask the students to act as they just did it. But what exactly did they do? How should we characterize their action? This is the question the story begs. Making the sign of the cross after saying Amen, as if the blessing I had pronounced were a part of Catholic ritual, was this simply their way of showing respect? Though unconventional, was it, when all is said and done, benign? Or were they appropriating my Jewish benediction? Later I shall tell you how I saw the experience at the time, once I had got over the initial jolt, but in the context of this lecture, the incident is just a preface, and the questions it raises are like signposts pointing in the direction in which I want to take us. The title of the lecture is Appropriating Judaism, ? And the question mark is intended to signify that following in the footsteps of Socrates, I am more interested in pursuing inquiry than I am in formulating a theory. I shall consider a series of cases where, as in the anecdote I just told, this question of whether Judaism is being appropriated seems to arise. However, I am not in the business of answering the question, of giving verdicts in each of the cases I consider, so much as in asking it. And my interest in asking it lies ultimately in pondering the very terms of the question. In a sense, the project of the lecture is to query the question. The cases I consider, and I shall not consider them thoroughly, will serve the purpose of helping me interrogate the two concepts that constitute the question in the title. Appropriating. What does this mean? Judaism. What's that? Accordingly, the lecture is reflective rather than didactic. I shall not hesitate to express an opinion from time to time, but if you are hoping for hard and fast conclusions, then be prepared to come away with nothing. The same brand of nothing that Socrates offered when he professed unwisdom concerning what he called Talmegista, the most important things, the greatest things, the things that matter most. The concepts in question in my title are among the things that I consider matter most. My method is also, after a fashion, Socratic. When Euthyphron keeps changing his answer to the question, what is piety, Hosion, Socrates says, I quote, the lover of inquiry must follow his beloved wherever it may lead him. One of my favorite lines from Plato. In other words, you follow the question wherever it takes you, which, as methods go, is not exactly methodical. It is more like meandering. Call it wandering. In this lecture, I shall, as a Jew, wander like a Greek, pursuing the inquiry in the manner of Socrates, sometimes like him at a loss as to what to say. I shall follow my nose. And since I'm the one who said that, it's not anti-Semitic. The lecture falls into two parts, which correspond to the two components in the title, the act of appropriating, part 1, and Judaism, the object appropriated, part 2. Part 1 proceeds via two kinds of cases, the practice of holding Christian Seders and the movement known as Christian Zionism. The complexities of this discussion lead to part 2, where I reflect on the nature of the object that is or is not being appropriated, Judaism. What is it? Calling it a religion or a faith, does this dignify it, or is it in itself an act of appropriation? What is appropriation? This fundamentally is the Socratic question that the lecture will follow wherever it may lead. Part 1, appropriating. Christian Seders. Now, this certainly sounds like an oxymoron, and I had never heard of such a thing until Anthony Reddy, mentioned it in an email to me 3 weeks ago. He has kindly given me permission to quote him. Anthony wrote, a few years back, I remember an evangelical friend asking me to attend a Christian Seder service, which made me feel uncomfortable at the time. And he continued, but when they wanted to arrange a remote repeat version, I had the gumption to now say that it is an awful example of religio-cultural appropriation. He elaborated. Have a Maundy Thursday service as Christians and have done with it. But to have a mock Jewish event and then insert Christian bits into the ritual is appalling. I wrote back to Anthony and told him that I resonated to his remarks and that what he had said had given me an idea for a theme for my paper. The theme, appropriation of Judaism, took hold of my mind to such an extent that it soon appropriated the lecture. Hence the change from the title in the initial flyer for the lecture series. Not that my original topic, calling Judaism a religion, has disappeared. It reappears in part 2, but now through the lens of appropriation. Well, to begin with, why did I spontaneously think that Anthony was right to deplore the very idea of a Christian Seder? It's not as if your average Jew thinks that the Passover meal is off limits to non-Jews, Christian or otherwise. That said, the point is strongly contested among rabbis. At one end of the spectrum, there are those who think that there is a halachic prohibition on inviting non-Jews to the Seder, and at the other end, there is the view that it is practically an obligation to include them. Of course, if the point were not vehemently disputed, it would not be a genuine rabbinical discussion. And that is not entirely a throwaway line. It raises the question of who can speak for Judaism, a question to which I shall return in part 2. And if appropriation means, as one writer on this subject defines it, I quote her, the act of taking something from someone else for your own use without asking permission from the originator, then this question of who speaks for Judaism, bears upon the legitimacy of Christian Seders. For who is there, on behalf of Judaism or of world Jewry, to permit or forbid, even if there were a person or a body with the authority to grant or withhold permission, Would that be decisive? Even if the Great Sanhedrin was reconvened and its 71 judges gave a unanimous hechsher approval for Christian Seders, would that make them less dubious to Antony or to me? But if absence of permission does not help elucidate why both of us are leery of the practice, what does? Part of the answer is indicated by Antony's description of a Christian Seder. I quoted him. He calls it a mock Jewish event with Christian bits inserted into the ritual. Both elements in this description capture the sense of a ritual that does not ring true, that lacks authenticity, for Christians as well as for Jews. Moreover, the adjective mock carries the connotation that the practice is not only sham, but also somehow shaming. It makes a mockery of the meal on which it is modeled. But someone might say, what if a Christian Seder were designed in such a way as to accord full respect to the Jewish prototype? But there's the rub. Unless I have misunderstood, the phrase mock Jewish event suggests that the enterprise is phony or faux per se. The failure is not a function of design. But what accounts for this? Cultures, after all, borrow from each other without necessarily lacking integrity or giving offense. A case in point, funnily enough, is the Seder itself, the Jewish Seder, which appears to have been derived in antiquity from the Hellenistic symposium or banquet. This looks as if it was, in a straightforward sense, a case of cultural appropriation. But no one would think that a heinous crime was thereby committed by the ancient Jews against the ancient Greeks and Romans. Then what is the salient difference between the two cases? How come the Jewish appropriation of the symposium is kosher, while Christian appropriation of the Seder is not? Well, paradoxically, it is the greater degree of appropriation in the Jewish case. The Seder is not a mock Greek banquet with Jewish bits inserted. It is a total appropriation, transforming the meal essentially into something Jewish. But could it be then that the problem with Christian Seders is that they don't go far enough, that they don't sufficiently Christianize the meal? Well, this would certainly be an odd inference to draw. And there is one major obstacle that stands in the way of drawing it. Antony, in a subsequent email, puts it this way. He called the Christian Seder, quote, an expression of Christian supersessionism. Now, this is a much more comprehensive indictment than criticizing Christians for purloining a particular ceremonial meal, and it goes deeper. It amounts to saying that the Christian Seder appropriates Judaism as such, relegating it to the pre-Christian past and treating Jews, as Rebecca Cinnamon Murphy puts it, as relics rather than people. The title of this lecture series is Religion and Cultures of Exclusion/Inclusion, and supersessionism, you could say, excludes Judaism not by shutting it out, but by incorporating it, dissolving it into Christianity. Seen as supersessionist, the Christian Seder makes a meal of Judaism itself, devouring it whole and assimilating it into its sinews. Only the bones are left on the Seder plate. No act of appropriation could go further than this. But what counts as supersessionism? The question is a cue for another personal anecdote. And let me interrupt myself to confess that when I talk about Judaism, as it is called, I have a bent towards telling stories. This is because I follow in the footsteps not only of Socrates, but also the eponymous author of the 5 books of Moses. The Torah contains several different genres, but its overall form is narrative. The opening phrase of Genesis, in the beginning, is a classic formula for a tale. It's like once upon a time. It's the epic tale that unfolds over the 5 books takes the reader from the dawn of time to the death of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, via the exodus from Egypt of the children of Israel. And in part 2, I shall try to place Judaism in relation to this story. But first, speaking of the Exodus, which of course is the event the Passover commemorates, let me give you the personal anecdote that comes to mind when I asked the question, what counts as supersessionism? St. Bernard's Hall is run by the English Congregation of Benedictines and is a dependency of Ampleforth Abbey in Yorkshire. One evening on a visit to the Abbey, I accepted an invitation to attend Vespers. It was Eastertide, and this, of course, was reflected in the liturgy. One of the hymns, Ad Canem Agni Providi, the Lamb's High Banquet We Await, is an ancient composition dating from the 6th century, if not earlier. Sitting in the pew as an observer, reading the English translation, I was struck by the fact that it is thick with references to the Exodus, including the following lines. That Paschal Eve God's arm was bared, the devastating angel spared. By strength of hand, our hosts went free from Pharaoh's ruthless tyranny. Now, in case that didn't come across, here are the same lines in a different rhyming translation. He kept us on that Paschal night from that destroying angel's might, and saved us in a foreign land from Pharaoh's dreaded cruel command. Our hosts went free. He kept us and saved us. There is similar language in the Exultet or Easter Proclamation, another venerable hymn. Quote, this is the night in which thou formerly broughtest forth our forefathers, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, what strikes me is the use of the first person plural. I am reminded of Avodim Hayinu, a central passage in the Haggadah, which begins thus. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God brought us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. The same word, us, but not the same us. What does this mean? Who has the right to the word, Jews or Christians? Who is entitled to identify with the children of Israel? My answer in brief is neither and both. And the longer answer must wait until part 2. At this juncture, leaving you for now in suspense, I hope, I want to bring in the case of the Christian Zionists. In January, the BBC screened a documentary on the subject, Till Kingdom Come, Trump, Faith and Money. In one frame, we see a giant Magen David, shield or Star of David, a symbol of Judaism, being mounted on the wall over a large Christian cross in Binghamtown Baptist Church, an evangelical Christian congregation in Kentucky. When the installation is complete, a long shot of the church interior shows the two symbols aligned with the base of the inverted triangle of the Magen David superimposed on the horizontal arm of the cross. The fact that the two objects are equal in size and that neither dominates the other implies partnership, not appropriation. Christianity and Judaism, hand in hand or side by side, united in support of political Zionism and the Jewish state of Israel. A line from 40 Towers, the television comedy series, comes to mind. When Dr. Abbott, in one episode, a psychiatrist staying at the Torquay Hotel run by Basil Fawlty, John Cleese, witnesses a bout of the proprietor's bizarre behavior, he remarks dryly, there's enough material there for an entire conference. Well, I could say the same about the installation in Binghamtown Baptist Church and Christian-Jewish collaboration over Israel in general, but I am not here to unpack the whole shebang. I am looking at Christian Zionism through one lens only, appropriation. How does the concept apply in this case? As we shall see, the permutations are bewildering. To begin with, who is appropriating what from whom? If appropriating is the right word. If the what is Zionism, then the answer to this question depends partly on how Zionism is defined. For the sake of argument, let us say that Zionism, or at least political Zionism, means the restoration of the Jewish state in Palestine. The phrase, the restoration of the Jewish state, is from the opening sentence of the preface to Theodor Herzl's 1896 seminal pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, or the state of the Jews. But Herzl left open the question of where the state would be located. Palestine and Argentina seemed to him to be potential sites, but basically what he proposed was sovereignty in, and I quote him, a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation, end of quote. So it seems he was less of a Zionist than the Earl of Shaftesbury, the acknowledged lay leader of the Christian evangelical movement, who made the following entry in his diary in 1854, quote, there is a country without a nation, and God now, in his wisdom and mercy, directs us to a nation without a country. The nation he had in mind was the Jews, the country, Palestine. This was 32 years before Herzl. Herzl was also less of a Zionist than Joanna Cartwright and her son Ebenezer, two English Puritans who in 1649 drew up a petition addressed to the English Council of State under Oliver Cromwell as follows. I quote from the petition, that this nation of England with the inhabitants of the Netherlands, where they were living, shall be the first and the readiest to transport Israel's sons and daughters in their ships to the land promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for an everlasting inheritance, end of quote. This was almost 250 years before Herzl. The Cartwrights, moreover, were by no means the first Puritans to propose the restoration of the Jewish state in the land of Israel. The idea had been mooted in nonconformist circles for many years. But you could perhaps argue on this basis that Jews appropriated Zionism from Christians. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, where did the Christians get the idea in the first place? They took it from the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, or Old Testament. So on the face of it, you could say they took it from the Jews. Not only took it, but folded it into their doctrine of the second coming of Jesus and the end times, when 2/3 of the Jews, all those Jews who do not convert to Christianity, will be wiped out. A scenario that is difficult to reconcile with the image of Christianity and Judaism hand in hand. So, this is a Christian appropriation from Judaism with an apocalyptic sting in the tail. You could, I suppose, argue in this vein. You could also argue in the opposite vein, that there are Jews who, in the name of Judaism, co-opt Christian Zionism to promote the interests of the Jewish state of Israel. Take, for example, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, founded by Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein in 1983, an organization featured in the BBC documentary Till Kingdom Come. A 40-minute video on its website has the title, Christians and Jews Together for Israel. It raises, that's to say the fellowship raises around $140 million a year to fund Aliyah, Jewish immigration to Israel, and almost all this money is donated by evangelical Christians. In the documentary, Yael Eckstein, Rabbi Eckstein's daughter and the current CEO and president, addresses the congregation in Binghamtown Baptist Church in Kentucky. Quote, you are part of something big right here, she assures the congregation, bigger than I think you even realize. And she explains, the destiny of the Jewish people is the destiny of this church, and the destiny of this church is the destiny of the Jewish people, end of quote. Christianity and Judaism side by side, each perhaps co-opting the other. There was another side-by-side moment 2 years ago, one that gives a double twist to the notion of appropriating Judaism, and it came in the afterword that Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis wrote for a lengthy report published by the Faith and Order Commission of the Church of England, God's Unfailing Word, Theological and Practical Perspectives on Christian-Jewish Relations. That was the name of the report. Well, since Rabbi Mervis's remarks raised questions about the nature of Judaism, I shall use them to introduce part 2 of the lecture. Part 2, Judaism. Rabbi Mervis's afterword begins by recalling the day when he and Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, stood next to each other in Jerusalem, facing the Kotel, the Western Wall, each of them, as he put it, absorbed in prayer. This was, Rabbi Mervis says, I'm quoting, a moment that will forever remain with me as uniquely powerful and inspiring. he goes on to make a vital distinction. I quote him again. I was acutely aware that however indelible the mark of the experience was on me personally, far more consequential was the deep symbolic importance of an Archbishop of Canterbury and Chief Rabbi praying alongside each other in kinship before the remnants of the Holy Temple. End of quote. The distinction he makes that I am calling vital is between Ephraim Mervis, the individual, and Ephraim Mervis, the Chief Rabbi. What he goes on to say, he clearly says as Chief Rabbi. He elucidates what he calls the deep symbolic importance of the occasion. He says, given, quote, the pain that has so often marred the long history of Christian-Jewish relations, it was, quote again, a moment of genuine healing. He looks back through the annals of history and calls his ancestors to mind, wishing he could, and I'm quoting again, somehow let them know that one day the foremost spiritual leader of the Anglican Church would join a chief rabbi in prayer at the Western Wall in a sovereign Jewish state, realizing our 2,000-year-long dream of returning to our homeland, end of quote. Notice how in placing or locating the event, he leaves the categorical difference between an ancient site, the Western Wall, and a political territory, a sovereign Jewish state. In the next paragraph, he slips back, as it were, placing the event in the land of Israel. He writes, quote, the deeply rooted connection members of the Jewish faith have with the land of Israel is a fundamental part of who we are and goes to the heart of our Jewish identity, end of quote. Notice finally his use of the first person plural, our dream, our identity, who we are. On the one hand, despite the kinship that he asserts with Christianity, our and we refer to Jews alone. On the other hand, they encompass Kalal Yisrael, the whole of Jewry, and not just the living, but also 2,000 years of ancestors. The conjunction of these points add up to a new twist to the notion of appropriating Judaism, as I shall now argue. When discussing Christian Seders in part 1, I raised the question of who, if anyone, can speak for Judaism. Evidently, Rabbi Mervis believes that by virtue of his title, Chief Rabbi, he qualifies. Actually, the title is a mite misleading. The full title is Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth. This refers to one Orthodox denomination in the UK, the United Synagogue, to which about half of British Jews are affiliated. Roughly the same number do not belong to any synagogue at all. In their eyes and in the eyes of every other Jewish denomination, Orthodox or otherwise, the office holder of Chief Rabbi has no official standing. The government, however, and the general public tend to treat the Chief Rabbi as though he were the Jewish Pope, able to speak for all Jews, or at least the UK branch, or minimally all religious Jews in the UK. This is an error. Rabbi Mervis knows it is an error. He knows, moreover, that Jews, not least religious Jews, have always been divided over Zionism, even more so than they are over inviting non-Jews to Seders. And while a deep Jewish attachment to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is beyond dispute, Rabbi Mervis conflates the land with the state in the comments that I read out earlier. If he was speaking as an individual, as Ephraim Mervis, the man, he would be entitled to make this conflation. Even as Rabbi Mervis, it is his right. But in this afterward, he emphasizes his status as Chief Rabbi, as if this were a status rooted in Judaism, which it is not. As if his view about Zionism were the view of Judaism itself, which it is not. As if Judaism has a view about Zionism, which it does not. As if he could speak for Judaism. Rabbi Mervis is not unfamiliar with rabbinical disputation. Like anyone else, perhaps as a rabbi himself even more so, he would chuckle at the throwaway line that I uttered in part 1, and which I said is not a throwaway line, the one about the range of rabbinical views on the subject of inviting non-Jews to the Seder. This was the line. Of course, if the point were not vehemently disputed, it would not be a genuine rabbinical discussion. But Rabbi Mervis in this afterword presents a point that is vehemently disputed among rabbis and among Jews generally, as if it were indisputable, asserting it with the authority that he arrogates to himself by virtue of the title Chief Rabbi. What would you call this if not an appropriation of Judaism? It is, moreover, an appropriation of the worst kind, one where a dominant party uses their dominant position to claim ownership of a heritage that is the common property of all Jews. Quote, open a Jewish daily prayer book used in any part of the world, Rabbi Mervis once wrote, and Zionism will leap out at you, end of quote. Except that it will not. Zion certainly will leap out at you. The word is ubiquitous in Jewish liturgy, but not Zionism, not unless you first add the ism, creatively reading it into the text. In his essay, Our Homeland, the Text, George Steiner defines a Jew as someone who, quote, always has a pencil or pen in hand when reading. I am drawn to this definition of a Jew. The text is given. The role of the Jewish reader is to suggest a take. Clearly, when Rabbi Mervis describes Zionism as leaping out at you from any Jewish daily prayer book, he does not think of this as a take. He thinks it's a given. He imagines that he is simply reporting what is there for all who have eyes to see, and this in a way is the essence of all fundamentalism. It's as if we have no choice in the matter. Zionism lies in wait on the page, ready to leap out and grab us by the throat. He is unaware of the pen or pencil in his hand as he reads. His ink is invisible to him. He does not know that he is spinning the text, but let him spin it. Only not in my name, and not in the name of Judaism itself. As we have seen, Rabbi Mervis refers in his afterwards to members of the Jewish faith. This quaint expression should give us pause. To what extent would the ancestors that he calls to mind, or indeed their descendants today, recognize themselves in the phrase? How many Jews in this country, for example, profess any kind of religious faith? God knows. To be fair, Rabbi Mervis is merely using a façon de parler, and he cannot be held accountable for the vagaries of the English language. But the phrase members of the Jewish faith is freighted. It is part of a lexicon that has been shaped over centuries, largely by Christianity, such that standard ways of talking about Judaism are inherently loaded. Norman Solomon calls this the framework problem. I quote him this is from his Historical Dictionary of Judaism. The reader who inhabits a Christian environment inevitably comes to Judaism with a cargo of Christian concepts and assumptions, end of quote. This gives another twist to the notion of appropriating Judaism, one that makes Christian Seders look like a picnic in the park. What, pray, is Judaism? The concise Oxford English Dictionary defines Judaism concisely as, quote, the monotheistic religion of the Jews based on the Old Testament and the Talmud. But setting aside the infelicity of sticking old in front of testament, the definition does not ring true to me. The polysyllabic monotheistic seems to me rather stilted, rather Greek, as if Judaism were an Oxford philosophical society for the advancement of the thesis that the sum total of divine beings is less than 2 and more than 0. In this definition, the very spirit of the definiens contradicts the definiendum. In other words, this doesn't sound like Judaism to me. I'm not even sure the word Judaism sounds like Judaism to me. And if Rabbi Mervis were to look far enough back through the annals of history, I think he would find ancestors who felt the same way. If he looks in the Tanakh, he will not find Judaism or a classical Hebrew equivalent of the word, nor for that matter will he find a word that means religion. Neither religion as a category nor Judaism as the name of a religion exists in the Hebrew scriptures. Steve Mason demonstrates at scholarly length that, and I quote him, there was no category of Judaism in the Greco-Roman world, no religion too, end of quote. And after a scrupulous examination of the sources, Mason, referring to the Greek and Latin terms that we translate as Judaism, observes, I quote, by far the preponderance of known occurrences of Judaismos or Judaismos is in Christian writings. In earlier writings, the word Judaism, or these equivalent words in Greek and Latin, functioned rather like the word Hellenism, Hellenismos. It signified a culture or civilization, the culture of the Judeans, the inhabitants of Judea. From the early 3rd century, writes Mason, and I quote him, things began to change dramatically among Christian writers. The word Judaism became, in his words, a kind of intellectual diminutive, the vestige of a once grand culture that, after paving the way for Christianity, has lost all nobility. The pivotal figure, he says, was the church figure Tertullian, whose writings in the 3rd century CE were, in his words, crucial to Christian self-definition. Every time Tertullian used the word Christianismus, he paired it with Judaismus, Christianity with Judaism. This pairing contrasted, Mason says, a living system with a defunct precursor. Timothy Barnes, in his book Tertullian, a historical and literary study, observes, I quote him, for Tertullian, as for many later Christians, Judaism was an unchanging fossilized faith, not to be taken seriously or deserving proper attention, end of quote. During this period, Mason explains, during this period, Mason explains, Christian authors, and I quote him, generated a static and systemic abstraction, which they called Judaismos, Judaism. In short, the very name Judaism, as its new meaning was forged in antiquity, has Christian supersessionism written into it. First, the name was taken away from the Judeans in antiquity, and then it was given to the Jews, to us, as the name for our heritage. There could not be a more profound Christian appropriation of Judaism than the name Judaism itself. The concise Oxford English Dictionary, as we saw, defines Judaism as a religion. This, you might think, is something that can be taken for granted. However, as Louis Jacobs points out, and I quote him, Louis Jacobs, by the way, used to be the rabbi of the congregation to which I belonged for many years in London. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us. But as he points out, I quote him, as an abstract term, the word religion is found in neither the Bible nor the Talmud. The category religion, along with its companion, the secular, has evolved over time, largely within the crucible of Christianity. And this process has continued into modernity. There's a massive literature on this question, the process of the evolution of the category religion, along with its companion, the secular, has continued into modernity, which even when rejecting religion, continues to bear a Christian stamp. Judaism over the centuries has accommodated itself to these changes, but it has always been a square peg in a round hole. The implications of this for the state of Israel's idea of itself as Jewish, and therefore for Zionism, are meticulously explored by Yaakov Yadgar, Professor of Israel Studies here at Oxford, in his 2 books, Sovereign Jews and Israel's Jewish Identity Crisis. But to go down that path now would take us too far afield, even in a lecture that wanders as much as this one. Instead, I shall pick up an observation of Daniel Boyarin's, one which brings us back to Rabbi Mervis's façon de parler. Boyarin writes, I quote, Christian identification of Judaism as a religion has had ongoing and complex effects on Jewish self-definition from late antiquity until modernity, but never until modernity has it issued in the notion of Judaism as a faith. He puts the word in quotes. So to say again, I wonder How many generations of ancestors would recognize themselves in the phrase members of the Jewish faith? I, one of their descendants, do not. I speak not just as one of their descendants, but also as an heir to their legacy, the heritage or tradition that goes by the name Judaism. And when I look back on the terrain that I've covered in this lecture, two cases stand out: Christian appropriation of the name and nature of this heritage, personified by the church father Tertullian, and, strange as it might sound, Jewish appropriation, represented here by Chief Rabbi Mervis. Both appropriate a legacy to which I, among others, lay claim. When something that is rightfully yours is taken away, you should take it back. So let me make a stab at reappropriating Judaism. What is Judaism? A mosaic, pun intended. It is a collection of texts starting with the Torah, a set of references, a sensibility, a vocabulary, stories, humor, styles of argument, symbols and rituals, history and memory, ways of thinking and approaches to life and death. It is an atmosphere I breathe, a deep well on which I draw, and God, or Hashem, is a word that wells up from its depths. God, who in the beginning, in the opening verse of Genesis, is uttered in the same breath as heaven and earth, as if these three words belong together, as if together they shatter the silence of the void, as if they were inseparable, as if everything that follows in the Torah must be seen in the light of their conjugation, which boils down to this: creator on the one hand, created on the other. What does this mean? That is the question that I inherit. Do not ask me if I believe in God or if I believe that God created heaven and earth. It's not a question that I inherit. As a Jew, I am a reader, not a believer. It is a matter of picking up a text, seeing it as mine, and then reading it with pen or pencil in hand in the midst of living a life. The text, the Torah, is the thing. The text is a Zen koan that tests the wit and the character of the reader. With this in mind, let me go back to the question left hanging in part one, when I touched on the fact that both Jewish liturgy at Passover and Christian liturgy at Easter say we, our, us, when referring to the children of Israel and their departure from Egypt. I asked, who has the right, Christians or Jews, to the first person plural? Who is entitled to identify with the Israelites? Neither and both was my verdict. Well, here, as promised, is the longer answer. It goes via a reading of the biblical narrative, and please indulge me if I embellish a little beyond the strict requirements of my remit in this lecture, because when I retell the biblical narrative in the text, I cannot always keep my virtual pencil or pen under control. Let us pick up the thread of the story at the place where the Hebrew slaves, after a 3-month schlep in the wilderness, find themselves, pun intended, Mount Sinai. They find themselves, to be precise, presented with an offer from someone even grander than the master of an Oxford college, the master of the universe. Now, God is an astute operator. She or he knows how to drive a hard bargain. First, he or she lures a destitute people out into the wilds, and then on a bare mountain in the middle of nowhere, amid the razzmatazz of fire and smoke and the fanfare of the shofar, talks up a storm. God makes them an offer that they had to be mad to accept, but which they could not refuse. One does not turn down an offer from one's master. Besides, they were in no position to say no. They were bereft of the means to survive in the wilds of Sinai. True, they had probably stashed away a supply of unleavened dough, but, to paraphrase Deuteronomy 8:3, human beings cannot live by matzah alone. As for the manna that had sustained them to this point, Hashem could turn off the supply at a moment's notice. So God seemed to have the children of Israel over a barrel. Be that as it may, Moses presents them with a choice, not once, but twice. First at Sinai, then 40 years later in the land of Moab, when they are perched on the verge of Canaan. And I know I'm conflating these two episodes. Moses says to the people, I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. Deuteronomy 30:19. Given that these are the options, the choice rather makes itself, but in choosing life, the people get more than they bargained for. They acquire a brand new identity. Hear, O Israel, exclaims Moses, addressing the entire congregation, quote, today you have become the people of the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 27:9. The people of God. What does this mean? And what does it entail in terms of a way of life? The very idea is outre. Levinas called it a scandal. Not only is it the ultimate chutzpah, it carries a double dose of mortal danger. For a chosen people is a proud people, the envy of the nations. Pride and envy, the one begets arrogance and chauvinism, the other breeds hatred and contempt. But there it is, a gauntlet laid down to the people, a koan to test their character and their wit. In any event, becoming the people of God seals the fate of the Israelites. The rest, as they say, is, so to speak, history. But whose? One answer lies inside the text, where the story is handed on from book to book, from Moses to Joshua to the Judges to the prophets, and duly recorded in the annals of Kings and Chronicles. These are the chapters in the career of a people inscribed in a book forever closed, a complete testament. But outside the book, in the world, beyond the pale of the book, where the future is open, whose history and whose fate? Enter us, the Jews. Who are the Jews? We, they, are the people who, peering over the lip of the book, espy the children of Israel and exclaim, look, that's us. We're them, see? But no one on the page looks back at them, at us, to confirm our view. There is no mutual embrace. It is a one-sided relationship. We Jews might identify with the Israelites, but the Israelites don't identify with us. They interest us, but we don't concern them. They are too occupied with being themselves the people in the book. We take the story of Israel to be our story, but it is a take. We take it as given, but many a slip twixt give and take. What is given is the Torah. How we take it is down to us. Seeing it as given specifically to us, seeing ourselves in the part of the people who in the text receive it, is a reading for which we bear full responsibility. We are entitled to identify with the Israelites, but it is not an identity that we receive passively. It is one we assert by choice. All Jews are in the same position as Ruth the Moabite, who declares to Naomi, your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Ruth 1:16. When we recite Avodim Hayinu in the Haggadah, when we say we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God brought us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, it is not our ancestors' genes that are talking, it is us. Christians in this respect are like Jews. When at Easter they sing, by strength of hand, our hosts went free from Pharaoh's ruthless tyranny, they too take something as given. The selfsame act is performed in both cases, the act of identifying with the children of Israel, and why not? Neither Jews nor Christians are, as a matter of genealogy, descended from the Israelites in the biblical story, and even if they were, so what? But both are at liberty to inherit the mantle of the people of God, if they are willing to take the risks that go with such an inheritance. Hence my verdict, neither and both. It comes to this. Christians and Jews alike appropriate the Hebrew text, and it is a perfectly appropriate thing to do. What is not appropriate is to take one another's take away from each other, stamping our own brand upon it or erasing it altogether. When, another point left hanging from part one, the students at St. Benet's Hall made the sign of the cross after saying Amen, I was, as I confess, taken by surprise. It's not customary for people to cross themselves after the hamotzi, the Jewish blessing over bread, but nor is it customary for the hamotzi to be recited before dinner at St. Benet's. Once the moment of panic had passed, I understood this, that although everyone round that table had taken part in a single ritual, I did not trespass on their devotion by reciting the hamotzi, and they did not appropriate my bracha. The ritual, in a sense, transcended itself. This, at any rate, is how it struck me on reflection, and it strikes me still the same way. Our different paths had, to use a term without prejudice, crossed. Anthony, I have a brief afterword. Do I have time to give it? It'll take me 2 minutes. Afterward, l'chaim.
Yes, you do. Go ahead.
I mentioned at the outset, thank you. I mentioned at the outset an experience that I said I would narrate at the end, and it's about what happened after I wrote to Father Henry in May 1998 to ask if there was room in the following year at St. Benet's for a residential visiting fellow. To close the lecture, I would like to tell you what transpired. In his reply, Father Henry thoughtfully explained what I was getting into. Basically, he wrote, I'm quoting him, It is a Benedictine house and we live as a monastic community. He went on to say cordially that I would be, quote, most welcome to come and live with them for my sabbatical year. I read his reply with a mixture of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, this was the response I was hoping to get. On the other hand, how come that I got it? Probably, I thought, Father Henry, noticing that I am at a Catholic university, St. Xavier, has jumped to the wrong conclusion about who I am. He would not have known that I was raised in a kosher home and that I had an Orthodox Jewish education. So, girding my... Now, I didn't want to accept his offer on false pretenses, but nor did I wish to lose it. So, girding my loins and feeling as though I were treading on eggshells, I wrote back as follows, and I'm quoting. Since my own upbringing and education until 18 was religious, I am accustomed to an environment that combines the academic with the devotional. However, I continued breaking the news as gently as I could. My affiliation is not Catholic, nor even Christian, but, pause for a deep breath, Jewish. Consequently, I confessed, I suppose I will not be able to participate fully. It's a problem for me. I do see that this might not be what the hall has in mind for a visiting fellow, especially one who is living on the premises. To this ponderous, tortuous message, I received the following response. Bear in mind that Father Henry is a monk of Ampleforth, a priest, editor of the New Jerusalem Bible, and was at the time a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission. He wrote, and I quote him, "My mother was Jewish. I have an array of Jewish cousins, and I value highly the Jewish tradition." And then he added, "I love all things Jewish, with certain limitations about Netanyahu. So I will be all the more delighted to have you," end of quote. Well, were it not for the limitations about Netanyahu, I might not have accepted his offer. But I did, I came, and we became friends. And it was in the course of that first year, at several late-night assignations in his study, that I discovered that our two traditions share the same pious appreciation for malt whiskey. So I wish to leave you with an image floating before your eyes, an image that I shall take with me when I leave the Fellowship of St. Benet's after 23 years at the end of this term. Henry and I sitting side by side, clinking shot glasses and drinking to the health of two different forms of life, forms of Chaim. His as a Catholic and mine as a Jew. L'chaim. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was fantastic. Let's not show our customer appreciation. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Stop this.